He was just an old man in a faded jacket, ignored, dismissed, forgotten, until one wrong arrest shook an entire town. This is not just a story about injustice, it's about quiet strength, overdue respect, and the kind of hero who never asked to be noticed, but changed everything anyway. Watch until the end, you'll never look at a stranger the same way again. Elmsworth, Virginia, a town known for its peace and predictable calm. Neatly paved streets basked under the golden hue of a spring sunset, and the whisper of wind through old oak trees made time feel slower here. On that April evening, Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks sat in his patrol car parked beside Central Park, sipping lukewarm coffee. Another uneventful shift, he thought. Probably just a few traffic stops and back home before dark. Across town, an elderly man shuffled into Martin's grocery. His faded military jacket clung loosely to his thin shoulders. His face, weathered by time and sun, was lined with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much but spoken little. Few took notice. He was familiar, but only vaguely, the quiet old man living in the cabin by the woods. His name was Clarence Hughes. No one gave him a second thought. No one ever asked what he had once been. But within the hour, everything in Elmsworth would change, and the man they had overlooked for years would become the one they could never forget. Clarence moved slowly through the store, choosing a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and a can of tomato soup. He read labels carefully, as if each decision held weight. At the checkout line, he waited patiently behind a young man in a hoodie fumbling with his wallet. In a rush, the wallet slipped to the floor, and the man hurried out, groceries in hand, without noticing. Clarence bent down, picked it up, and looked around. But before he could speak, the cashier's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. "Hey, did you just steal that?" Clarence blinked, startled. No, I was just picking it up." "He dropped it," he said calmly, but she wasn't listening. The store manager came storming over. "Keep him here," he barked. Moments later, the front door chimed. Sergeant Nathaniel and his rookie partner, Officer Ethan Price, entered. "That's him," the manager said firmly. "Tried to steal a wallet." No one asked Clarence what happened. No one asked why he still held the wallet carefully in both hands. A dinner of soup and warm bread had turned into something far more bitter. "He tried to steal the wallet," the manager repeated as the officers stood at the scene. Nathaniel didn't ask a single question. He simply said, like it was a routine, "Sir, please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Clarence spoke gently with the patience only age can teach. "Officer, I believe there's been a mistake. I didn't—" "Hands behind your back," Ethan barked, gripping the old man's arms and snapping the cuffs shut. There was no hesitation, no pause to think. Outside, a few passers-by had gathered. Some looked on in silence, others turned away as if it wasn't their concern. No one stepped forward. No one asked if it was right. At the station, Ethan tossed Clarence's jacket on a bench and sneered. "Stealing wallets now, huh?" Clarence said nothing. He sat in the holding cell, hands folded, eyes steady, unreadable. Nathaniel watched him through the glass. "There's something strange about him," he muttered. "He's just a career thief," Ethan replied, trying to shake the unease in his voice. But something about that old man's silence made the station feel suddenly uncomfortably loud. While logging Clarence's personal items, Nathaniel reached into the inner pocket of the old military jacket. There, tucked neatly away, was something unexpected. A well-preserved silver badge. It shimmered faintly under the harsh fluorescent light. An eagle insignia. Beneath it, United States Special Forces, Clearance Alpha. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Matt, come here, look at this." Ethan leaned over. "That looks real," he whispered, the joke now gone from his voice. Clarence's wallet revealed no credit cards, just a worn military ID, one unlike anything they'd ever seen. On the back, a phone number. Nathaniel picked up the phone and dialed. "Sergeant Brooks, Elmsworth, PD. We have a man here, name's Clarence Hughes." There was silence. "Repeat that name," a voice replied sharply. "Clarence Hughes." Another pause. Then with crisp urgency, "Secure your station. Do not question him. Do not engage. Do not let anyone near him. We'll be there in 30 minutes. The line went dead. Nathaniel slowly lowered the phone. Ethan said nothing. Clarence remained in the holding cell, quiet as ever. But when Nathaniel approached, the old man looked up and offered a faint smile. "You might want to brew a fresh pot of coffee," he said. "It's going to be a long afternoon." Exactly 30 minutes later, 4 black SUVs rolled into the station's parking lot. Their windows were tinted, their movements synchronized. Men and women in sharp suits stepped out, crisp, precise, efficient. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here with answers no one had expected. A tall woman with a no-nonsense walk entered the station first. "Where is Mr. Hughes?" she asked. Nathaniel, stunned, pointed toward the holding cells. She didn't wait. With a nod, she walked straight to the cell and opened the door herself. No badge, no formality. "Mr. Hughes," she said with calm authority. "Apologies for the inconvenience. We'll take it from here." Clarence stood slow but steady. He shook her hand. Then before leaving, he turned to Nathaniel and Ethan with a nod, not angry, not smug, just understanding. As the SUVs disappeared into the distance, one agent stayed behind. He pulled Nathaniel aside and said quietly, "You have no idea who you just put in cuffs. That man has saved lives, prevented terror attacks, stopped wars most people never knew were coming. His file is so classified even I'm not cleared to see all of it." Then he added, "You're lucky he's a patient man." As Clarence disappeared into the distance in the last black SUV, a heavy silence settled over Elmsworth Police Station. Ethan sat still, his eyes distant, like he had just awakened from a fog. Nathaniel opened the envelope left behind by the agent. Inside was a handwritten note, no signature, no threat, just truth. Sometimes the most precious thing a man carries is patience in the face of prejudice. Today he gave you a gift not of forgiveness, but of opportunity. Use it well. No anger. No demand. Just a mirror held up quietly. Nathaniel folded the letter with trembling hands. Across the room, Ethan walked slowly to the bench where Clarence's coat had been tossed earlier. He picked it up with care this time. It was no longer just worn fabric. It was a symbol of honor, of pain, of a man they had treated like a criminal simply because they never paused to ask who he was. Neither spoke. But in that silence, both men began to understand they hadn't just cuffed a veteran, they had handcuffed their own humanity. By morning, Elmsworth wasn't sleepy anymore. The town's stillness had been shattered by headlines: "Decorated veteran wrongfully arrested. FBI confirms his identity." Local news sites ran the story. Then national outlets picked it up. On social media, the video of Clarence being cuffed at the grocery store exploded. Thousands of comments followed. "How could they do this to him? Where's the justice for our heroes? America, wake up." Nathaniel sat in his office scrolling through the comments. One photo hit him hardest. Clarence's wrinkled face, eyes calm, wrists bound in metal. A face they had mocked, a life they had reduced to suspicion. And now that face was everywhere. Ethan, meanwhile, had gone quiet. He deleted his accounts. He ignored the buzzing phone. But guilt doesn't go away just because you go offline. The town of Elmsworth began to shift. People no longer waved at patrol cars with the same warmth. Respect had given way to questions. And in a place where nothing ever happened, something had happened that would echo for years. The internet might move on, but the stain on that uniform wouldn't wash out easily. 3 days later, a small package arrived at the station. No return address. Just careful handwriting to Sergeant Brooks and Officer Price. Inside was a folded note in a gleaming military challenge, coin heavy rare, given only in moments of deep respect. The letter read, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. I've seen people fall from poor judgment, and I've seen them rise stronger. You got it wrong, but getting it wrong isn't the end. It's the beginning if you choose to change. Stay sharp. Stay humble. Clarence Hughes." Nathaniel set the coin in his palm. It was heavier than metal had any right to be. He looked at Ethan, who stared at the letter, his lips trembling. Neither spoke. But that single gesture from Clarence, a man they had humiliated, spoke louder than any punishment. It wasn't a call for vengeance. It was a call for reflection. The mayor of Elmsworth called a town meeting. The community center overflowed. Local news vans parked outside. Inside, Sergeant Nathaniel and Officer Ethan stood under fluorescent lights, flanked by Police Chief Julie Moran, freshly returned from out of state, now facing a wildfire on her doorstep. Chief Moran didn't mince words. "We failed Mr. Clarence Hughes, and in doing so, we failed this community." Nathaniel stepped forward. The murmurs quieted. His voice was low, steady. "I have no excuse," he said, "only the weight of my actions and a commitment to learn from them." A few clapped, quiet, tentative. Others remained silent, arms crossed. But someone had to speak. And finally, he was ready to stop hiding behind protocol. "I didn't listen to him. I judged before I asked. And I treated a man of honor like a suspect." More claps followed. Then Ethan spoke. Younger, voice thinner. I was trained to act fast, but no one trained me to look closer. I'm learning now. I'm sorry. The crowd didn't cheer wildly. But for the first time since it all began, someone had looked them in the eye and told the truth. That evening, Ethan returned to where it all started, Martin's grocery. He didn't go in. He just stood outside the glass door staring at his reflection. A badge no longer sat on his chest. His uniform was gone, but the shame still clung like armor. A voice broke the quiet. Planning to apologize to your reflection, Ethan turned. Clarence stood there. Same jacket, same quiet presence. I didn't expect you to come back here, Ethan admitted. Clarence shrugged. Best bread in town, he said, then added, I don't let one bad memory ruin good habits. Ethan swallowed hard. I was wrong, sir. I saw you and I didn't see you at all. Clarence nodded slowly. That's what most people do. See the story they've already written instead of the truth standing in front of them. Ethan looked down. What now? Clarence smiled gently. You've said sorry. Now make it matter. Then he added, not all heroes wear medals, and not all villains look like monsters. The world's a little more complicated than the rulebook says. And with that, he walked away, leaving behind not silence, but the sound of a conscience finally waking up. After that emotional encounter outside Martin's grocery, Ethan returned to the station without saying much. His badge still hung heavy on his chest, but it didn't feel the same. For the first time, he questioned whether he was wearing it with the integrity it deserved. Meanwhile, Clarence returned to his quiet life. He walked his usual route through the neighborhood, but now the looks had changed. A baker stood a little straighter when Clarence entered the shop. A kid on a bike stopped and waved. One passerby even whispered, "Thank you for your service, sir." Clarence never asked for attention. In fact, he had spent most of his life avoiding it, because he knew all too well the deepest wounds weren't from bullets or bombs. They were from the eyes that didn't see you, or worse, saw you and decided you didn't matter. But this time something felt different. The town wasn't just looking at him, it was finally seeing him. And while no award, no ceremony could ever undo the harm of being forgotten, sometimes the smallest gestures, a nod, a wave, a soft thank you could begin to heal the invisible scars that silence never could. One quiet afternoon, Clarence received a phone call from a teacher at Elmsworth High School. Her voice trembled with a mix of hope and nerves. Mr. Hughes, my name is Emma Rhodes. I teach history here and my students are learning about the Vietnam War. I was wondering, would you consider sharing your story? Clarence paused. He had told his story only a handful of times and never in full. Most people wanted a hero's tale. Few wanted the truth, the battles fought off the field long after the last shot was fired. What exactly would you like me to talk about, he asked. Emma replied. Whatever you think they need to hear, not just the war, but what it means to serve and then come home. There was a silence between them. Then Clarence said softly, all right, but I won't sugarcoat it. We wouldn't want you to. They set the date. 1 week later, Clarence would stand before dozens of young faces. Not to be honored, not to be applauded, but to plant something deeper and an understanding that respect isn't about medals, but about how we treat the stories we don't know. The day of the school event arrived. Clarence wore his old military jacket, worn at the seams yet dignified. As he stepped onto the stage of Elmsworth High's auditorium, the room fell completely silent. Not the usual shuffling or whispers of bored teenagers, just stillness, a kind of reverence. Clarence didn't open with tales of valor. He began with something far more intimate. When I came home, there were no parades, just questions like, are you really a soldier? Or worse, nothing at all. He spoke of the mud-soaked jungles of Vietnam, yes, but more so of the quiet battles back home. The restaurants that refused to serve him, the job interviews that ended the moment he walked in. The way a black man in uniform could still be treated as a stranger in his own country. Students leaned forward in their seats. Some wiped tears, others simply stared wide-eyed. Then he told them about that day at the grocery store, how a simple act of decency had nearly ended in handcuffs. Sometimes, he said, the fight isn't with guns, it's with assumptions. And those can kill something in a man just as fast. After Clarence finished his talk, the principal stepped onto the stage with a small box in hand. Her voice quivered. Hughes, on behalf of Elmsworth High, we'd like to honor you not just for your service, but for your strength in telling the hard truth. Inside the box was a medal, not a government-issued decoration, but something crafted by the students themselves. Etched into the metal were the words, "For teaching us that silence can be strength and strength can be quiet." Clarence held the medal in his palm, his fingers brushing its edges. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The applause came slowly at first, then all at once. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was something deeper, earned, not given. For many in that room, it was the first time they had truly thought about what it meant to serve and be forgotten. Clarence bowed his head in gratitude, not for the medal, but for the fact that his words had been heard, not polished, not softened, just real, and that in the eyes of these young people had been enough. Among the students sitting near the back of the auditorium was someone unexpected: Ethan, dressed in plain clothes, avoiding attention, but completely focused. He watched Clarence's every movement, every word. After the event, Ethan waited quietly by the hallway exit. Clarence spotted him and nodded. "I didn't think you'd come," Clarence said. "I had to," Ethan replied, "not to be seen, just to listen." Clarence studied him for a moment. Still wearing the coin, Ethan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled it out, Clarence's challenge coin, given with forgiveness and hope. Clarence smiled. "Then make it mean something. Don't let it just be a souvenir." "I won't," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've changed. Not all at once, but I'm trying." Clarence placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask." And in that hallway under the dim school lights, a young man who once mistook silence for guilt stood beside a man who had learned to carry dignity without noise. Not as officer and veteran, but as student and teacher. That night, Clarence returned to his modest cabin on the edge of town. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots, familiar and comforting. He set a kettle on the stove, poured a cup of black tea, and sat at the old oak table where silence often kept him company. He opened a small box of keepsakes, his life in fragments. A black and white photo of his unit standing tall in front of a helicopter. A folded letter from a comrade who never made it home. A yellowed citation for bravery, edges curled by time. He touched each piece with quiet reverence. He wasn't remembering war. He was remembering what it cost to carry its memory. For years, no one had asked, and so he had learned to fold his story neatly, like his jacket, and place it out of sight. But after the school visit, he felt something shift, not in the world, but in himself. For the first time in decades, someone had looked beyond the uniform, the wrinkles, the silence, and simply asked to understand. And perhaps that's what every soldier hopes for: not parades, not medals, just to be seen and believed. Word about Clarence's speech spread like morning fog through Elmsworth. The local paper printed a photo of him on stage, eyes shining beneath the auditorium lights. "The soldier we forgot," the headline read. But more than the article, it was the ripple he left behind that mattered. One barista started greeting every older customer with a simple "thank you for your service." A librarian set up a display of memoirs by veterans. Even the police department launched a new initiative for community awareness training, Chief Moran's way of saying, "We heard you." But what touched Clarence most was a letter handwritten in wobbly teenage script. "Dear Mr. Hughes, I used to think old people just told stories to hear themselves talk. But when you spoke, I heard something I didn't know I needed. You made me want to be braver. Thank you." Clarence folded the letter gently and placed it in the same box that held war medals and old photographs. This letter would sit right on top, because in all his years of service, few things had felt as powerful as a child telling him, "You mattered." One chilly morning at the park, Clarence sat on a bench reading a worn paperback when raised voices broke the calm. Two teenagers were mocking an elderly Asian man walking by with a cane. "Lost old man," one sneered. Clarence stood slowly. No anger in his stride, just presence. He stepped between them. "You boys know this man's story?" he asked. They looked confused. "Neither do I," Clarence said. "And that's why I'd never treat him like a punchline." The teens mumbled and walked away embarrassed. The old man, blinking in surprise, whispered, "Thank you." Clarence nodded. "You're not alone out here." There were no cameras, no applause, no recognition. But for Clarence, that was the point. You don't do the right thing because people are watching. You do it because you remember how it feels when no one did. And if even one person feels safer because you spoke up, then that moment becomes louder than any headline ever could. Weeks later, Clarence received an official envelope from Washington, an invitation to a national ceremony honoring distinguished veterans, business class airfare, hotel accommodations, a spotlight he'd never asked for. He stared at the letter for a long time. Then he picked up his pen. "I appreciate the gesture, But I've already been honored in the eyes of a teenager who said, I changed her in the voice of an officer who finally saw his mistake in the town that's trying to do better. That's enough for me. He sealed the envelope and mailed it back the same day. Clarence didn't need a podium. He had found his place in moments without microphones. In the way the cashier now greeted him by name. In the quiet nod from Chief Moran at the corner diner. In the smile of a kid who held the door open and said, "Thank you, sir." He didn't need headlines. He just needed a world that no longer looked away. One spring afternoon, Clarence sat on his porch watching sunlight dance through the trees. A breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwood. Birds chirped. Somewhere down the road, children laughed. In his hands was a letter from Ethan. "Mr. Hughes, I've decided to leave the force. Not because I'm quitting, but because I want to rebuild how we serve. I'm starting over as a community educator for new officers. Because of you, I learned that protecting people starts with respecting them." Clarence read the words slowly, letting each sentence settle in his chest. He folded the letter and placed it beside the others. He didn't say anything out loud, but inside something exhaled. Not relief, not pride, just peace. Because when you've carried your story alone for too long, knowing someone else now carries part of it with care is everything. Clarence never spoke much about what happened. He politely declined interview requests, avoided speaking engagements, and returned to the quiet rhythm of his days walking the dog, reading by the window, fixing a neighbor's squeaky fence. Yet somehow his story kept moving. People told it in whispers over coffee. Students mentioned him in essays. His name was quietly spoken with respect. A local shop named a corner booth after him. Not for fame, but because people simply wanted to remember him every day. Clarence Hughes had never asked to be a symbol, but by enduring injustice without bitterness, by holding his dignity, when others tried to strip it away, he had become more than a man. He had become a mirror, a reflection of what a community can become when it's brave enough to face itself. His legacy wasn't in medals or citations. It was in the subtle shift of hearts, in the people who paused before judging, who listened a second longer, who asked, "What's your story?" instead of assuming they knew. He didn't need to say more. His silence had already spoken volumes. One afternoon, a teenager named Malik knocked on Clarence's door. He stood there nervously holding a college application folder in his hands. "I heard what happened to you, sir," he said. "I want to join the National Security Academy, but I'm scared. Scared they'll look at me and see a threat before they see my dreams." Clarence invited him in. No grand speech, just tea warmth in space. "Let me tell you something," Clarence said. "I've worn a uniform longer than most people have been alive. But before I ever wore it, I was already being watched, judged, tested. And I still am." Malik swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" "You walk in anyway," Clarence said softly. "And when they stare, you stand taller. Not because you owe them anything, but because you refuse to disappear." That night, Clarence wrote a recommendation letter. At the end, he added, "This young man doesn't just deserve your institution, he deserves a world where no one has to prove their humanity before they're heard." And with that, he helped carry someone else's dream a little closer to the light. Clarence's story didn't stay in Elmsworth. A high school in Georgia invited him to speak. A police training seminar in California asked if he'd contribute via live stream. But he only said yes when the invitation came from people who wanted real change, not just a soundbite. Still, he stayed grounded. He handwrote replies to students who had written to thank him. He read every message from strangers who said they saw the world differently now. At a community meeting, Chief Moran stood before the townspeople and said, "We don't just owe Mr. Hughes an apology, we owe him better." Clarence, sitting in the back, didn't stand. He didn't wave. He just nodded. He didn't need a podium. He had already changed the room, not by shouting, but by choosing the rarest kind of power, the kind that listens, endures, and forgives even when it has every reason not to. Winter crept in early that year. Clarence wrapped himself in an old wool coat and stood by the window watching frost cling to the glass. Outside, the trees stood bare. The world looked quiet, familiar. But something had shifted. When he walked into the post office, people paused to hold the door. The barista had his coffee ready before he ordered. The librarian asked if she could feature his story during Black History Month. Even the smallest kindnesses felt like ripples from a deeper current. Ethan visited, sometimes sitting on the porch steps in silence. They didn't always speak. They didn't need to. Once Ethan asked, "What do I do when people don't believe I've changed?" Clarence replied, You don't live for their belief. You live in a way that makes them want to believe again. Kindness had become habit in Elmsworth, not perfect, but present. Respect no longer had to be earned with proof. It was offered first, then deepened. The wind still blew as it always had, but the town had learned to face it with new eyes. Clarence passed peacefully one spring morning. No struggle, no sound, just a soft breath slipping into the breeze. On his bedside table were three things: his old military jacket, a letter from Malik, now accepted into the academy, and a leather journal nearly full. On the last page in delicate handwriting was one final message. You don't need applause to leave an echo. You don't need a spotlight to leave light. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is built in silence and carried by those who once chose not to listen, but learned. The funeral was small, just as he would have wanted. No flags, no trumpets. But the crowd was large: students, officers, neighbors. People whose lives had bent gently toward grace because of him. On his tombstone, 5 words were etched. He spoke without needing to. And in the days that followed, people kept telling his story not to glorify him, but to remind themselves that sometimes heroes walk quietly beside us. And when they're gone, we don't need to shout their name. We only need to live the lesson they left behind. True respect begins where assumptions end. Clarence Hughes didn't change the world with anger or vengeance. He did it with dignity, patience, and truth. His story reminds us that real strength often comes in silence, and real justice begins when we choose to truly listen. Let us never judge a person by their appearance, their age, or their quietness, because sometimes the loudest lessons come from those who never raise their voice.